Every empire leaves behind more than ruins, some leave invisible chains. Where once cannons thundered, contracts whispered. Where once gold was stolen, debt was planted. Africa, they said, was free, yet a new empire had already begun. In the shadows of independence, a new kind of conquest emerged. A conquest without armies. Africa is not poor. Africa is plundered. And the chains that bind her now are not forged in iron, but in contracts, ink on paper signed under the shadow of power. In the decades after independence, the struggle for freedom shifted from battlefields to boardrooms. And in those rooms, deals were struck that would shackle generations yet unborn. Control oil and you control nations. Control food and you control people. The flags were raised, the anthems sung. Across the continent, nations tasted freedom, but independence came with hidden terms. In Washington, London, Paris, men in suits redrew Africa's future. Loans flowed like rivers. Generous, they claimed, but every coin carried a hook. The 1960s were years of hope. Nations cast off colonial rule, determined to build industries, schools, and hospitals. But the colonial inheritance was a poisoned chalice. Economies dependent on exporting raw materials, importing manufactured goods, and vulnerable to the whims of global markets. Then came the oil shock of 1973. Economies stumbled. And with desperation came the bait. Borrow, they urged. We will help you modernize, stabilize, grow. Desperate for cash, African nations turned to the only lenders willing to extend a hand, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But the promises were gilded cages. Soon the debt swelled beyond measure. And the lenders returned, demanding austerity. Health budgets slashed. Schools closed. Food subsidies withdrawn. Africa's children paid the interest with their hunger. This was no accident. These were the structural adjustment programs engineered by the IMF and World Bank. They promised discipline but delivered despair. Entire nations became laboratories of austerity. They demanded currency devaluation, subsidy removal, trade liberalization, and privatization. In short, surrender your economic sovereignty. Ministers signed under pressure. Presidents bent under threat. A continent rich in resources became poor in sovereignty. The debt trap had snapped shut. The mechanism of control. Debt is not just owed, it is engineered. Every dollar borrowed returns with conditions. Every signature carries a clause unseen. The IMF and World Bank spoke of reform. But their prescriptions were always the same: devalue your currency, cut your spending, sell your assets. To service the loans, governments sold state enterprises at bargain prices. To balance the books, they cut schools and clinics. To feed the bankers, they starved their own people. Farmers were told to stop growing food for their families and instead grow cash crops for export. Cocoa, coffee, cotton, shipped abroad while villages went hungry. This was not development. It was extraction in a new language. Colonization dressed as economics. The mechanism was elegant, diabolical. The loans created dependency. The conditions ensured compliance. And the debt itself guaranteed control. When Africa defaulted, it was punished. When the IMF delegation came, they did not negotiate. Credit withdrawn, trade restricted, governments toppled. The choice was clear: accept their terms or lose all access to credit and foreign investment. The debt trap was not an accident, it was architecture. But Africa did not remain silent. Leaders like Thomas Sankara spoke with fire. Debt is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa. For this courage, he was silenced, yet his words outlived him. Others turned to new creditors. By the 1990s, many African nations were paying more each year to service debt than to educate their children or treat the sick. The principal had long been repaid, but the interest was eternal. China's roads, ports, and rails arrived with fanfare, but the question remained, had the master changed, or only the method? Debt is the modern battlefield. Its weapons are spreadsheets, its soldiers are economists, its victories measured in interest paid, not lives uplifted. But history is never fixed. Across the continent, new generations rise. Innovators building, women weaving futures, villages harnessing the sun. Africa is not poor. Africa is rising, but only if she refuses the chains. The debt trap is a design, not a destiny. The true wealth of Africa is her people, her knowledge, her unity. Freedom will not be lent. It must be taken. Chains are not only broken by struggle, they are broken by vision, and Africa's vision must be her own. The first chain to break is the lie that Africa is poor. Africa is not poor. She is plundered. Her minerals, her oil, her forests, her people. The world feeds on her wealth while calling her empty. The second chain is dependency. For too long, Africa has looked outward for salvation. But sovereignty cannot be borrowed, and dignity cannot be lent. The continent must invest in herself, trade with herself, feed herself. The third chain is division. Colonial borders carved wounds that still bleed. Yet a united Africa, from Accra to Cairo, Lagos to Nairobi, could stand not as 54 fragments, but as one civilization. Already the chains rattle. Across the continent, young Africans are coding, farming, inventing, creating. Women are leading cooperatives, turning scarcity into abundance. But breaking chains demands courage. It demands leaders who cannot be bought, citizens who cannot be silenced, and a people who will not forget Sankara's warning, "He who feeds you controls you." Sovereignty is not given, it is taken. Learn more at powerafrica.com, because Africa's story will no longer be written by outsiders.